This week, I decided to do something fun. The current situation has got me fantasizing and reminiscing about travel. So I thought I'd tell the story about how I snuck in the back door when nobody was looking to become an international drum clinician. Here I am going on 5 years ago, giving a clinic to a sold-out room in Thailand. This was the second to last stop on my clinic tour, which also included Hong Kong and Taipei. Sorry, I don't have a picture of the actual clinic, so dig this shot of the Taipei 101. Anyway, here's more footage of the clinic in Thailand, where one of the most famous drummers in Thailand hosted me at his private studio space. Me! I've also done clinics in the States, in LA, and in my hometown in Montana. And somehow, somebody let me do this. Anyway, who am I? Do I have any business teaching drum clinics? The answer is nobody and absolutely not. So what in blazes am I doing, and how did I worm my way in the back door of this industry which otherwise hosts perfectly respectable people? Stay tuned. Okay, I have to simultaneously make this interesting to people who already know me and people who might be seeing it for the first time thinking, who's this idiot? Let me see. Is this any better? Hang on, I can't move my... Okay, this is not working. All right, this is going to have to do. There's one big difference between me and everybody watching. It's that you probably have more gigs. I'm serious. Brief history. I graduated from music school and was getting some gigs. Gradually, though, it was getting harder and harder to get work. To be fair, part of it was that I moved out of town for a year and some of the people I had been playing with moved on to find other drummers to work with. Let's pause for just a second and talk about two things. The first is permission. It's the idea that in order to do something, somebody has to pick you. The second is a tiger metaphor. Remember the Tiger King? Okay, the story, which might be apocryphal and might actually be about elephants, goes like this. In captivity, they keep tigers in like an 8x8 pen. Later, even after the barriers are removed, some will still stay in this 8x8 square, in a prison of their mind. In music and media, traditionally there was this thing called carriage. It just meant that since Ted Turner controlled the airwaves, he could decide who went on TV. Since you needed Sony to record an album or print a CD or LP, since you needed NPR to interview you.
So in settings like this, it's really like the first note is probably the most important note because it determines the sequence of events to come.
Since you needed the monk competition to ratify your legitimacy as a musician, and I'm not knocking any winners of that competition, many of whom are my friends, except remember the tiger. If you woke up in a world where you didn't need the gatekeepers anymore, would you even realize it? Keep that in your head as I tell this next part. So it's around 2008, 2009, and I realized I don't need anyone's permission to play gigs. I've got it partly right and, as I realized later, partly wrong. Anyway, I mounted an assault, leading my own bands. In that manner, I played gigs in New York for the following 4 years. We'd play wherever they'd take us. And gradually I grew frustrated. First, many of the best musicians were choosy about the venues they play in. Certain spots were on the list and hence worth people's time, whereas other spots were less so. It was also a dance to get enough people in the room to avoid playing to tables and chairs. Again, embarrassing if you've got an international touring artist on stage with you. I wanted to pay the musicians a good amount that reflected my respect and appreciation for them, and I'd often have to do that out of my own pocket, because I was lucky to break even with door money. Getting gigs in those name spots grew harder and harder, because everybody else was trying to get the same gigs. So it started to get difficult to get the reps in. Just like a comic craving stage time, I knew if I wasn't gigging regularly, I'd get rusty. I get hustled to get gigs with other people's bands, but that required hitting the late night jam sessions instead of spending time with my family. And those gigs were often at crappy venues, and many of those artists weren't willing to pay out of their pockets. And sometimes you'd be left with $5, a beer, and a $160 parking ticket for learning 3 sets worth of other people's music, schlepping uptown with your drums, and getting home at 2 a.m. So what was wrong? What about the tiger in the cage? What about the we don't need the gatekeepers anymore, man? Well, I'd made a rookie mistake. I tried to create a positive sum game in a zero-sum dynamic. It just means there were still scarce resources in the system. Musicians' time and stage time at the venues. Because so many drummers were competing for slots at name brand venues, those slots, when you would get them, were like gold. If you got one, you needed to show the venue you could fill it with screaming fans who were going to pay for cover charges and drinks. That's why, name musicians. Most lesser-known band leaders weren't going to roll the dice with lesser-known musicians in their bands. Hence a power law dynamic, where a small group of musicians were getting called for 75% of the gigs. Getting that experience, getting better, getting more well-known, getting called more. Classic Matthew effect. Let's pause. Was this insurmountable? Definitely not. I know plenty of dedicated people who massaged this zero-sum game until it started working for them. Building a direct relationship with a venue owner or manager. Building a neighborhood scene with a built-in crowd. Using that portable crowd to elevate so-called local talent. Lesser known but still highly skilled musicians. Building a band that gradually gets its own following, etc. And I could have done all that. But then, the internet distracted me.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I realized I could do it virtually. So I started calling my friends to play original tunes on an extremely low rent version of the checkout. Advantages. I didn't have to wait for a slot at a venue. I could play whenever I could schedule the band. To a small degree, I could offer these musicians access to a new venue, the internet, by virtue of my willingness to wrestle with the filmmaking, which by the way was ghetto, and the tech. So my offer to play was more novel than just another gig at Hojo's or the restaurant of the week. And because the audience was virtual, there was never any risk of empty chairs. If the video ended up getting 1,000 views, that was way more eyeballs than would have seen it at any of the live venues I was playing at the time. In the early episodes, I hosted discussions about everything I've been talking about in this video. I didn't have the words at the time, but it was about music in positive versus zero-sum game dynamics.
Assuming they're trying to follow the traditional model.
Right, of playing gigs and maybe some students on the side and tour.
Gradually, I started to combine the online show with real shows. There was just one problem. How was I going to pay for all of it?
So one of the things I wanted to break down is Ed Soph's jazz ballad brush pattern.
What if I could sell drum courses on the internet, like MOOCs or the Great Courses Plus? At the time, hardly anybody was doing this, except the get-rich-quick guys. But I binge-listened to a bunch of their podcasts and realized that maybe, just maybe, I could do it for the drums. Big fast forward through 3 to 4 years of scraping by and thinking I would never succeed, much of which is covered in my How I Make Money on YouTube video. But I figured out how to make a little scratch by teaching drums on the internet. As my YouTube channel grew, that little scratch grew to be almost enough to live on. In 2019, it would finally become enough to live on.
How to play like your heroes, and of course I'm going to take that in an unexpected direction.
So I'd like to imagine you following me through this whole journey. Like you're thinking, how did this guy do it? Because maybe I could do it too. And you're grokking that all these details are important to answer that question. But maybe you're just thinking, cut to the chase already. So the clinics were actually an offshoot. And they were the true illustration of this tiger in the cage thing. My whole life, I'd wanted to tour the world playing music. But I'd been so cowed by my struggles making my utopian game work in New York, I'd reverted back to this mindset of wait for a sponsor, try to get somebody to offer me a clinic. No. What if I just chose myself? When I looked down, I had 40,000 YouTube subscribers. Surely there must be enough channel fans in a couple of major cities who would pay a small amount to cover a venue. If I chose places I wanted to visit anyway, I could legitimately write off half of the qualified expenses from my taxes. And disclaimer here, I'm not a CPA. If you want to do this yourself, you should talk to a real CPA. I know I did. But anyway, by that methodology, I could essentially live the life of an international touring musician without anybody's permission. And by the way, I know from talking to a bunch of my friends who tour with other people's groups, there's a lot of downside to being a hired gun touring that I was not getting with this self-created lifestyle. And something else had happened as a result of making all these videos. I'd gotten better. Way better. So I decided to book a trip to Asia, where my in-laws live. Through either the channel or music scene connections, I located venues in 2 places, Hong Kong and Taipei. Thailand happened differently. We'll get to that in a minute. With each of the DIY venues, I asked channel fans on the ground to help me book a venue for a certain date and time. Then I pre-sold tickets. If I could make enough to fill the room respectably, I'd put on the clinic. If I couldn't, I'd refund everybody and ask for a refund from the venue. Luckily, I filled up both clinics. Thailand happened differently. When I spoke to some friends of the channel in Bangkok, one of them acquainted me with this guy, one of the biggest drum clinicians in Thailand. He convinced them to host me, and to my astonishment, they did, doing most of the publicity to fill up the room and even paying me a guaranteed rate. It was one of the most humbling experiences of my adult life. I was super nervous, but I'd practiced so much that by the time it was time to present, it was just fun. Since then, I've done a small number of clinics in other places. I was honored that Eric Watson invited me to participate in the DBK clinic in LA in 2017. And I also did a DIY clinic there the year before. And recently, I did one in my hometown at the music store where I used to take lessons. Yay! People came! Oh! That's what this shirt is. I've also gotten a small number of offers to do clinics in other places, and people have mostly passed because I've asked them to cover bare bones travel expenses if it was somewhere I wasn't planning on traveling anyway. And I've still got my white whale list of places I'd love to do clinics. I almost made it happen in Japan last fall, but I didn't quite make it line up. And I've never done the UK or Europe. And of course, hardly anybody's going anywhere these days, especially Americans. And that's cool, because we've got the internet. Anyway, what have we learned? It's a little pat to just say, you don't need permission, just do it. Because that won't work in a zero-sum game where you've still got gatekeepers. But we still have the internet and the ability to travel, which we will get back despite the United States' colossal f*** up of the pandemic. Anyway, the internet and the ability to travel gave us something huge. The ability to choose our game. Tired of competing for limited slots in your local area? Find somewhere you'd like to visit where your services are novel. Just the fact that I was a jazz drummer from New York was enough to attract a lot of people to the Thailand clinic. And I'll talk about this more next week when I talk about the counterintuitive dynamics of sponsorship and why I'm not sponsored, but you need an audience. And that takes time to build. But once you have an audience large enough that you can fill a small venue in a handful of major cities, you can literally make your own game. And that's how a nobody with 0 credits became an international drum clinician. Anyway, if you're thinking about following in my footsteps, I highly recommend it, but I offer a word of caution. You do need to be able to play, or at least think you can play. And if you feel like you'd like to work on your drumming, and you've seen enough of me that you trust me to help, I recommend my courses, the coaching course, the practice course, and the solo course. All of which we only open up a few times a year, and we only offer exclusively to people on my list. If you'd like to get on that list so that you hear about the next time we're launching one of those courses, I invite you to click below the player and enter your email in on the next page. And for doing that, I'll also send you a bribe. My 3-video mini course, which will improve your playing more in the next 3 weeks than it's improved in the previous 6 months. Dudes, hope you found this helpful. If you enjoyed it, or if you've had a contrasting experience, please leave a comment below. See you next time. So we grab our script, memo 59. It's actually the number of the memo.